When I woke up the morning after Christmas, my phone looked like it was having a breakdown. 36 missed calls, 11 voicemails, 9 texts from my father, all in this weird spiral from panic to fake concern. The last voicemail had come in at 7:12 a.m., and his voice sounded nothing like the man who'd stood at the head of the dinner table a few hours earlier, holding a whiskey glass and telling the entire family I was done. Cut off. Out of the business, out of his life, out of his exact words were, "From this point forward, you get nothing from me." And now, he wouldn't stop calling. At first, I just stared at the screen, honestly, kind of numb. Then I saw the email sitting under all the missed calls, the one from my grandmother's attorney, and that's when I realized why he was panicking. The thing is, my dad had spent years acting like he was the one with all the power. Christmas night was the first time I stopped trying to protect him, but to understand how we got here, I need to go back. I was 28 then, living in Dayton, Ohio, in a one-bedroom apartment over a laundromat with my girlfriend Hannah. It wasn't glamorous. The walls were thin, the heater rattled every time it kicked on, and if the people downstairs were doing laundry late, the whole floor vibrated like a cheap motel bed. But it was ours, and honestly, I loved it because everything in that apartment felt earned. The couch was second, the coffee table had a water stain shaped like Florida, and our plates didn't match, but nothing in there had strings attached. That mattered more than I realized at the time. My father, Frank, never really understood that. He owned a heating and air conditioning company called Franklin Air, and in our town, that name actually meant something. His trucks were everywhere. Red lettering on white vans, big slogan on the side, radio ads every winter, Little League sponsorships, the whole thing. To outside people, he was this self-made blue-collar success story, hard-working local business owner, generous guy. The type who'd shake your hand too hard and call you buddy while looking over your shoulder, someone more used. To me, he was complicated in the way some parents are when they love control more than they love peace. My parents divorced when I was 12. Mom, Linda, never told me everything, not indeed. But I was old enough to hear this through bedroom. I knew there had been money fights. I knew my father could turn ice cold in about half a second if he felt challenged. After the divorce, he made a huge show of blaming my mother for everything. According to him, she was bitter, dramatic, lazy, and selfish. According to pretty much everybody else, she was just exhausted. Still, he was my dad. When you're a kid, reaching for that relationship, even when it keeps burning your hand. So I did what I always did. I made excuses. I told myself he was just blunt. I told myself he had a temper. He worked hard. I told myself if I proved I was loyal enough, useful enough, good enough, eventually he'd relax and actually treat me like a son instead of an impotent fire. That's the part I'm embarrassed about now. I spent years trying to earn something that should have been. Anyway, after high school, I did 2 years at community college, mostly business classes, nothing fancy. I worked part-time, bounced between jobs, and for a while, I actually stayed pretty distant from him. We'd do birthdays, occasional lunches, maybe a football game. Then, when I was 20, he called me with what sounded like an olive branch. He said he needed help at the company. He made it sound important, said the office was a mess, payroll errors, scheduling, accounts slipping through cracks. He said, "I need somebody I can trust, Ryan. Family, not one of these idiots I have to be." And because I still had that stupid little hope in me, I said yes. At first, I feel like things were getting better. He gave me a desk in the back office and told everybody I was there to modernize the place. I cleaned up their customer system, fixed duplicate accounts, got them off paper invoices, and started organizing dispatch routes so techs weren't driving all over the county like maniacs. I learned payroll, vendors, maintenance agreements, emergency service logs, all of it. Within a year, I wasn't just helping, I was barely holding them together. And my father loved that. Not me. There's a difference. You've lived it. You know exactly what I mean. He'd slap me on the back in front of customers and say, "My son's the brains behind the operation." Then in private, he'd tell me I wasn't ready for more money. He'd promise, "Stick with me a few more years, and this whole business is yours someday." He said that a lot. Someday turned into this dangling reward that kept me. Anytime I brought up benefits, actual equity, or even a clearer title, he'd act offended. "Why are you nickel and diming your own father?" That line. God, I hated that line. Meanwhile, I was working 60-hour weeks. I answered emergency calls at midnight. I fixed payroll problems on Sunday. I handled angry customers. One of the field guys forgot a part or showed up late. If my father wanted to play golf, I covered. If he wanted a long lunch, I covered. If he made some promise he couldn't possibly, I was the one staying late trying to make it happen. And whenever something went right, whenever something went wrong, it was because I was still learning. The red flags were there from the start. I just kept stepping over them. Around the same time, he remarried. Her name was Melissa. She was younger than him by 12 years, always perfectly dressed, big white smile. One of those women who could say something nasty in a sweet enough voice that people laughed instead of flinching. She had a daughter from her first marriage named Chloe, who was in high school and mostly stayed out of the drama. And then she and my dad had a son together. Owen, who was 8 at the time all this happened. Melissa never openly. That would have been, honestly. She did the more polished version, the little comments, the tiny digs. Ryan, you're so lucky your dad kept you involved. Or, family businesses can be hard when people expect things emotional instead of professional. Stuff like that. Just enough to make it clear she saw me as leftover furniture from his first life. Still, I tried. I bought birthday gifts, showed up to Owen's soccer game, helped Chloe move into her. I went to the backyard barbecue, the forced family dinner, and the matching Christmas pajama photo. The year Melissa decided we were the kind of family that did that. Looking back, I was trying to earn in a house where my chair had already been mentally. The one person in that family who always saw things was my grandmother, my dad's mother. She was sharp as a tack even in her 70s. Tiny woman, silver, smoked way too much and then spent the next 40 years lecturing everyone about health like she'd invented vegetables. She loved crossword puzzles, cheap strawberry candies, and talking trash about people after they left the room. I adored her. More importantly, she adored me in that quiet, unwavering way that feels like oxygen when the rest of your family is all heat and smoke. She was also the reason my father's company existed in the first place. That wasn't a secret exactly, but it wasn't something he advertised. My grandfather died young, and Grandma June had gotten a decent insurance payout plus money from selling some family land years later. When my dad wanted to start Franklin Air and Heat, she helped him. She fronted the first real chunk of money, loaned him enough to buy 2 vans and lease a small shop. Over the years, whenever he got in over his head, she was the one who bailed him out. She'd joke that she was his silent partner, and people would laugh. But there was always something under that joke, a little edge. I didn't really understand how literal she meant it until much later. About a year before the Christmas dinner from hell, Grandma had a mild stroke. Nothing devastating, thank God, but enough that she needed help with appointments, meds, groceries, and keeping track of paperwork. My father made a whole dramatic scene the first week, talked about family, said he'd take care of everything. Then, like usual, real life showed up, appeared back into his own priorities. So, I stepped in. At first, it was small stuff. I drove her to physical therapy on Tuesday. I filled her pill organizer. I helped set up her online bank because she hated using her phone for anything except yelling at telemarketers. Then it became dinner twice a week, then home repairs. Then, sitting with her on long afternoons while she told me stories about my grandfather, about my dad as a kid, about how he was confident with character. One afternoon, maybe 8 months before Christmas, I was helping her sort through a metal file box at her kitchen table. The place smelled like coffee, old paper, and that lemon furniture polish used on everything. She was in a weird mood, quiet but alert, and she kept sliding certain folders to a separate pile. I asked what she was doing. She said, "Putting the important things where your father can't accidentally misplace them." I laughed because I thought she was joking. She wasn't. She looked straight at me and said, "Ryan, your father is charming when he wants something. Never confuse that with honesty." That stuck with me hard. A few weeks later, she asked me to drive her to an attorney's office downtown. Not my father's guy. A different one. Small brick building, name on the glass door. No nonsense. She told me to wait in the lobby. I did for almost an hour. When she came out, she looked tired but relieved. In the car, she said, "I needed to update some." I asked if everything was okay, and she said, "It will be." Then she patted my hand and changed the subject to whether the Bengals had any prayer that season. At the time, I didn't push it. Honestly, I figured it was will stuff, medical directive, all the things once they realize time is as endless as it used. I didn't know the worst part yet. I didn't know she was seeing things I hadn't fully let myself see. Over the next few months, my father got stranger with money. That was the first real shift. He started asking me to move payments around in the system. Not outright illegal stuff, at least not on the surface, but messy. Code Melissa's peak ad as community outreach. Push that vendor payment to next week. Put the lake house internet under office for now. When I questioned, he'd wave me off. It all washes out in the end, except it did. Not to me. I'm not some forensic accountant, but I handled enough of the books to know when personal expenses were creeping accounts. At first, a golf week. Then it got bigger. Furniture, landscape, a luxury SUV that was definitely not for company. More than once, I'd find an invoice on my desk with no explanation. And when I asked, he'd say, "Just do it." And here's the thing. People like my dad train you slowly. They don't start with huge boundaries. They start with little compromises, little moments where keeping the peace easier than pushing back. By the time you realize how far the line has, you're standing somewhere you never meant to be. Still, I wasn't totally blind. I started getting copies of anything that made my stomach twist. Not to use against him, not yet. Mostly to protect myself. I had this growing fear that if something ever blew up, he'd toss me under the bus. So I saved exported reports, took screenshots of unprinted things and kept them in a folder at home. Hannah knew about it, kind of. She didn't know every detail, but she knew I was anxious and that I didn't trust the way he handled money. Hannah had been telling me for years to put distance between me and my father. She wasn't dramatic about it. She'd just ask questions nobody else asked. If he promised you the business, why won't he give you anything in writing? Why are you doing payroll on Saturdays if he says you're not, man? Why does every favor him become a test of your loyalty? Those questions annoyed me because they were right. We'd been together 6 years by then. She was a nurse, practical, funny, hard to impress, the kind of person who could cut through one sentence. When I'd come eat, she'd let me rant for maybe 10 minutes and then go, okay, but what are you going to do about it? Not cruel, just grounded. She loved me enough not to let me live in denial forever. Then came November. Grandma June got pneumonia right before Thanksgiving. At first, we all thought she'd bounce back. She'd had health scares before, and always seemed too stubborn to actually lose to any of them. But this time, it was different. I remember sitting beside her in the hospital while the mist softly in the room smelled like sand and dry heat. She looked smaller than I'd ever seen, frail, still sharp, but tired in the deep way that my father showed up twice in 4 days. The first time, he paid 15 and spent 10 of them on his in the hallway. The second, he came in wearing a cashmere coat and acted offended that the doctor wouldn't discuss private details in front of him without paperwork. Grandma watched him the entire time with this expression I can only describe as disappointed but unsurprised. After he left, she said, he still thinks volume is the same thing as authority. I laughed because the alternative was crying. 3 days later, she asked me for her purse. She pulled out a folded envelope with my name on it. Just Ryan, in her shaky handwriting. She made me promise not to unless something happened to her. I said, Grandma, don't do that. She squeezed my wrist harder than I expected and said, promise me. So I promised. She died on December 7th. That date is burned. Cold morning, gray sky. Hannah was at work when the hospital called, and I drove there in a fog. When I got to the room, it was already too late. She looked peaceful, which people always say like it helps. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it just makes the loss quieter. My father cried at the loudly. That probably, but it's true. Cried like somebody were watching. He hugged everybody, told stories about how much his mother and family, talked about legacy and togetherness and honoring. He put on a better 45 minutes than he had in the last year of her life. Then at the reception, I watched him corner her attorney at the coffee station. I couldn't hear everything, but I heard enough. When are we doing the reading? That was the first thing he cared about. Not her cat, not the keepsake, not whether I was said the reading. The attorney, a calm woman named Caroline Reed, told him the estate matters would be addressed after the holiday, and my father got this tight look around his mouth that I'd seen 100 times before. The look he got when reality failed to line up with what he thought he would. I should say this now, because it matters later. I still did not know what Grandma had changed. I knew she'd seen a lawyer. I knew she was worried about something. I knew she'd left me that envelope, but I had not opened it. I was exhausted and honestly trying not to turn her death into a fight with my father 2 days after burying her. That was my mistake. Or maybe my mercy. Hard to say. A week after the funeral, I got called into my father's office at work. He didn't ask. He never asked. He just sent Tina from the front desk back to tell me, Frank wants you, now. When I went in, Melissa was sitting there too. Legs crossed, expensive boots, fake sympathetic face already loaded and ready to go. My father had a legal pad in front of him and that little hard smile he used when he was about to pretend something actually practical. He said the company was restructuring. I asked what that meant. He said they were bringing in an outside operations director, some guy named Trevor, a friend of a friend from Cincinnati who apparently had real leadership experience. Then he said I'd be transitioning administrative role starting in January. Less access, same pay, supposed to make it sound generous. I remember just staring. I'd been there 5 years. And I knew every system, every vendor, every tech, every seasonal client, every problem child on the route board, every recurring maintenance account. Half the reason the place ran at all was because I'd spent years untangling the messes he created. And now, he was demoting me for some outside guy with golf connections and a decent handshake. I said, "You're replacing me." He leaned back and actually smiled. "No," he said. "I'm correcting a mistake. I let Family Cloud business judgment." Melissa put a hand on his arm like, that was the moment something he cracked. Not because I was shocked, part of me is coming, but because of how cleanly he said it. Like my years there meant nothing. Like all the missed weekends, all the crap I'd absorbed for him. All of it could be rewritten in one sentence because he felt like. I asked him if that was why he kept refusing to put anything in writing about me taking over someday. He rolled his eyes and said, "Ryan, grow up. Someday is not a contract." That line hit me like a slap. I left his office shaking. Not dramatic shaking, not movie style. That horrible internal kind, where your hands work but your chest feels hollow and electric at the same time. I went to the bathroom, locked myself in a stall, and just sat there because if I'd stayed in his office another 30 seconds, I would have said something I couldn't take back. When I told Hannah that night, she went dead quiet. That's how I knew it was bad. She wasn't the kind of person who rushed to outrage. She'd usually ask for details. Not that night. She just put down her fork and said, "You need to stop protecting." I wish I could say I listened immediately. I didn't. A few days later, my Aunt Lisa called me. She was my father's younger sister. One of those people who'd spent decades smoothing things over because conflict made her physically uncomfortable. Sweet woman, chronic. She asked if I was still coming to Christmas dinner at Dad's house. I almost said no. I really almost did. But then she said, "Please come. It's the first Christmas without your grandmother. We need normal right now." That word, normal. It gets people into so much trouble. So I agree. That brings me to Christmas Day. I can still smell that house when I think about it. Honey ham, cinnamon cake, pine from the giant tree, and underneath all of it, the sharp bite of my father's bourbon. Melissa had gone all out. The dining room looked like a department store display. Gold place cards, velvet runner, cloth napkins tied with little fake holly rings. It was the kind of setup that screams we are a happy family so loudly you immediately know somebody's lying. I got there around 4 with Hannah. Mom wasn't invited, obviously. She hadn't been to one of my father's holiday dinners in 16 years, and probably would have laughed in my face if I'd asked. Owen was running around in a sweater vest. Chloe was from college being tired and detached. Aunt Lisa was already pouring wine, and my cousin Derek was helping. From the second I walked in, something felt off. My father was in one of those performative moods that never lasted. Too loud, too friendly. He clapped me on the shoulder in front of everyone and said, "There's my boy." Then, 2 minutes later in the kitchen, he leaned in and muttered, "Try not to make tonight about you." I hadn't even said anything yet. That's when I knew there was some kind of setup coming. I just didn't know how ugly. Dinner started fine. Or fake fine, which is its own art form. Plates clinking, Melissa asking Chloe about school, Aunt Lisa telling the same story about a coworker and a cheesecake disaster. My father talking over everybody anytime the conversation drifted away from him. I kept my head down, ate my food, answered when spoken to. Hannah squeezed my knee under the table once. I realized my leg had been bouncing for 10 straight minutes. God, I hate that I can. My father stood up, glass in hand, face already pink from drinking. He said he wanted to say something about family, about loyalty, about how the holidays had a way of showing you really stood with you when things got hard. The room went quiet in that immediate, instinctive they sense blood in the water. He started by talking about Grandma June, said she believed in hard work, respect, and gratitude. Fine, whatever. Then he pivoted, fast. He said, "It's disappointing when somebody spends years benefiting from your support and still can't show basic loyalty." My stomach dropped. I remember the exact feel of the fork in my hand, cold metal, a little grease on my fingers from the hand, the sound of Owen stopping halfway, Hannah going still beside me. I said, "Dad, what are you doing?" And he looked right at me and smiled. That smile. Jesus. He said, "No, let's do this openly, since you like acting confused." Melissa stared at her plate like this was all very unfortunate but necessary. Aunt Lisa whispered, "Frank," in that soft who never listened. He ignored her. Then he started listing he'd supposedly done for me a job, gave me opportunity, kept me close to the family, taught me that when I didn't have direction. Every sentence designed to me sound like a burden he'd generous. And then he said the line from the title, "A Whole Mess." In front of every, "As of tonight, I'm cutting you off." Just like that. He said I was no longer welcome at the company after the first of, said my access was revoked, said I should stop expecting to benefit from his money or anything he built. Then he looked around the table like he was for applause and added, "A man needs consequences when gratitude fails." I couldn't even process it at first. It felt unreal, like somebody had taken all the ugliness kept private, put it under a spotlight. My ears were hot. I could set of eyes on somehow me feel both exhausted and completely. I said, "I work for that company. I've worked my ass off for that company. Actually, you answer phones and move numbers around. Don't flatter yourself." That one, because it wasn't just insulting. It was erasing. Years of work gone in one sentence. Every lie he'd told about trusting, needing me, building something with me, All of it just dumped in the trash in front of the entire family so he could feel powerful for 5 minutes. Hannah said very evenly, "This isn't okay." My father pointed at her with his glass and said, "This is family business. Stay out of it." That was when I stood up. My chair scraped so hard against the wood floor, my hands were shaking. Not Ellie, not heroic. I was furious and humiliated and honestly closer to tears than I wanted to. I said, "You don't get to talk to her like that, and you don't get to rewrite what I've done for you." He stood too. Of course him had to become a dominant. He said, "You want honesty? Fine. You've always had one foot out the door. You're not built for this business. You're soft. You think because you're my son, I owe you ownership. I don't owe you a damn thing." Then, and this part still makes my blood boil, he looked at Melissa, then at Owen, then back at me and said, "This is my family now. Those are the people I'm building. Not to, not also, now." The room went dead silent. There are moments when your whole life rearranges itself in one sentence. That was one of mine. She wouldn't meet. Eric looked Chloe looked like she wanted to. Owen was confused. Hannah had gone pale with it. Melissa took a sip of like this was all beneath her. I said, "So, that's what this is. You wanted an audience." He said, "I wanted clarity." I laughed. It came out ugly and sharp because I was so angry I could barely breathe. I set my napkin on the table and said, "You know what? You've got it." He told me to leave my company keys. I pulled them out of my pocket, office key and side gate key on the same ring, and tossed them onto the table hard enough that the glassware rattled. Then I said something I meant with my whole chest. I said, "Don't call me later pretending this was a misunderstanding." His face tightened just a little, maybe because some part of him expected me to beg. That's what I usually in smaller ways. Not literally beg, but soften, explain, make it easier for him to climb down without losing. Not this time. Hannah and I grabbed our coats and left while he was still talking. And here's the part that matters. In the pocket of my coat was the sealed envelope Grandma had given me in the hospital, plus a reminder card from Caroline Reeves's office for an estate meeting the next morning at 8:30. I had almost told my father about that meeting, almost, but standing there in the driveway, cold air hitting my face, hearing muffled voices from the house behind me, something in me finally, I was done offering him he would only use against me. So I got in the car, and I said nothing. The drive home was not loud. That would have just brutal in that exhausted, hollow way. Whole body feels wrung out. Christmas lights blurred through. People were out walking dogs, carrying leftovers, doing all the normal little holiday things. And I was sitting there feeling like I'd just watched my father cut me out of the family with a steak knife and call it wit. About halfway home, Hannah reached over and took my hand. She said, "I need you to listen to." What he did was calculate. I knew she was right, but hearing it out loud still hurt, because calculated meant planned. Planned meant this wasn't bourbon talking. It wasn't a slip. It wasn't a bad move. He had chosen Christmas. He had chosen the audience. He had chosen the humiliation. He had wanted me publicly reduced. That realization made something go cold inside me. When we got home, I didn't even take my coat off right away. I just sat at our tiny kitchen table with the overhead light on and that envelope in front of me. Hannah made tea. I didn't drink. The radiator clanked. Somewhere downstairs, a dryer buzzed. It all felt weirdly loud. Finally, I opened the envelope. Inside was a short, handwritten note from Grandma June. It said, "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and I'm sorry for that. I need you to do one thing. Stop cleaning up your father's messes. Let the truth stand on its own. Caroline knows everything you need to know. Love you always, Grandma." That was it. One page, maybe 60 words. But honestly, it felt like she reached out from beyond the grave and grabbed me by the shoulders. "Stop cleaning up your father's messes." I must have read that note 10 times. Then I went to my laptop. Not to plot revenge, not yet. I just wanted to understand what was happening around me before he got the chance to spin it. I logged into my work backups, the files I'd quietly kept copies of over the past year, and started pulling together a timeline. Expense reports, email approvals, vendor payments, internal notes. The more I looked, the sicker I felt. There were charges I hadn't paid close enough attention because they'd come through in boutique inventory for Melissa's store, coded as client gift. Repairs at the lake house listed under fleet maintenance. Restaurant tabs filed as team dinners on nights there had been no team dinner. A jewelry purchase had somehow holiday bonus, except nobody at the company had gotten a holiday bonus that year. And mixed into all of it was pressure from my father a certain way. Change dates, delay records, smooth explanation. I wasn't imagining. He'd been using the company like a private wallet. I sat there until after midnight, building folders, organizing screenshots, writing down questions. Hannah went to bed around 1 and came back out at 2 because I was still at the table with the same expression on my face. She looked at the piles of paper and said, "This is bigger than dinner, isn't it?" I said, "Yeah." She asked if I was okay, and I laughed because what else was I going to do? No, I said. But I think I'm done being stupid. She kissed the top of my head and said, Good. I finally crashed around 3. I put my phone on silent because I couldn't take one more message from any family member trying to mediate what had happened. At that point, I still thought the next morning was just going to be a tense meeting with the attorney and maybe some more proof that my father had pushed me out of the company. I thought I'd get answers. I did not expect the earth to shift under his. So the next thing I remember is opening my eyes to sunlight and the violent buzzing of my phone across the nightstand. That's when I saw the missed calls. 36 from my father, not spread out overnight. The first one was at 12:48 a.m. The last one had come in less than 10 minutes earlier. There were also messages from Melissa, from Aunt Lisa, and even from Trevor, the outside operations guy I hadn't officially met yet. The sheer volume of it made my chest tighten. Nobody blows up your phone like that unless something big happened. Then I saw the email from Caroline Reed. Subject line, estate documents and immediate shareholder. I opened it, and for about 3 full seconds, I honestly thought I was too tired to read properly. My grandmother had not just updated her will. She had moved the majority ownership of Franklin Air and Heat into a trust before she died. And she left controlling interest to me, 51%. I read it again, then a third time, same words. There was more. A letter of instruction, temporary voting authority effective upon notice, a request for an emergency meeting related to the business, language about preserving records, an attached statement from a CPA firm retained by the estate. My grandmother had done this carefully, quietly, legally, completely. My father hadn't just been left out of some sentimental inheritance. He had spent Christmas dinner disowning the one person who now had the power to him from the company his mother had helped build. I sat straight up in bed so fast I almost got dizzy. Hannah rolled over and said, What? I handed her the phone. She scanned blinked, then looked at me with this expression I'll never forget. Half shock, half fierce, almost protective satisfaction. Oh, she said. That's why he's calling. Yeah, that was why he was calling. There were voicemails too. The first couple were still arrogant. Ryan, pick up. We need to discuss some confusion. Then more urgent. Call me back before you talk to anyone. Then angry again. You have no idea what you're doing. Then pure panic. Ryan, don't let that woman poison you against your own family. By the last one, he sounded frayed. Please call me. Please. We can fix this. That word nearly made me choke. Fix. Like I hadn't spent years fixing what he broke. The meeting with Caroline was in 40 minutes. Everything after that moved fast. Oh, we drove downtown through slushy streets and dirty snow piled on the curbs. The whole city had that day after Christmas feeling, quiet and hungover and still. My hands were so tight on the steering wheel, Hannah finally touched my wrist and said, Breathe. When we got to Caroline's office, my father's truck was already there. Of course it was. He was pacing in the lobby when I walked in. No coat on. Hair a mess. Face gray in a way I'd never seen. He looked like a man who had spent the night falling down a staircase he couldn't find the bottom of. The second, he came straight over. Ryan, thank God. That was his open. Like 8 hours earlier, he hadn't publicly told me I was nothing. I stepped back before he could put a hand on my shoulder. He clocked that immediately and lowered his. Oh, we need to talk privately. Caroline came out of her office right then, thank God, and said, No, we'll speak in the conference room with everyone present. He hated being told no, especially by women he couldn't bulldoze. You could see it all over him. Inside the conference room, the blinds were half open, gray winter light, coffee on a side tray, stack of folders at each seat. Aunt Lisa arrived a minute later looking like she'd slept in her clothes. Melissa came in behind her, tight and polished. No one said Merry Christmas. That part was. Caroline sat down, folded her, and started explaining the estate structure, the calmest voice I've ever heard. My grandmother, she said, had transferred her shares in Franklin Air to a revocable trust well before her death. Upon her passing, those shares transferred according to the trust terms. She had retained independent counsel. She had capacity. She had documentation. She had anticipated a challenge and prepared for one. Then she looked at me and said, Mr. Carter, effective immediately. You are the controlling shareholder. The room went My father just stared at her. Then he laughed, but it was that bad laugh people do when reality feels insulting. That's ridiculous, he said. I built that company. Caroline didn't flinch. Your mother's ownership stake is documented in the corporate records, tax filings, and prior operations. You are free to challenge the transfer. But as of now, Mr. Carter has controlling authority over the company. Melissa actually made a little choking sound. My father turned me so fast his chair scraped. And that question told me everything. Not, are you okay? Not, she really do this? Not even, why? just whether I'd known and failed to protect him from the consequences. I said, I found out this morning. He studied my face like he was trying to catch a lie. Then he did what he always did. He switched tactics. Okay, he said, suddenly softer. Then listen, your grandmother, people got in her head. She was grieved. She didn't understand. Caroline slid a Your mother left a signed statement addressing that exact claim. He opened it. I'll never forget his face while he read. I didn't see the whole page then, but I read it later. Brutal in the most precise grandmother way possible. She wrote that she had observed a pattern of financial irresponsibility, coercion, and emotional manipulation from her son. She stated that I had worked faithfully in the business, cared for her without expectation, and deserved protection from being used the way she believed I already had been. She said she feared my father would strip the company for personal use if left unchecked. She said the transfer was not punishment. It was prevention. That line. Not punishment, prevention. My father finished reading and went white. Then he exploded. He slammed the folder shut and started shouting about betrayal, insanity, outside influence, manipulation, all of it. Melissa jumped in too, saying this was unfair, that families don't blindside each other, which was honestly so rich coming from the woman who sat through Christmas dinner without blinking that I almost laughed. Caroline waited until they burned through their outrage, then dropped the next piece. My grandmother had also directed the estate to initiate an independent forensic review of company finance if I chose to enforce it. My father went silent, not calm, not accepting, just silent in the way a snake still right before it decides what kind of bite to use. That was when I knew she'd seen more than I had. Caroline turned to me and said, You do not have to make any decisions this second, but you do need to protect the company's records immediately. My father cut in. This is insane. He doesn't even know how to run field operations. He'll destroy everything. I looked at him, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel smaller. I said, Then maybe you shouldn't have fired the person running your office at Christmas dinner. Aunt Lisa shut her eyes. Melissa muttered, Unbelievable. And my father just stared at me like I'd spoken in another language. Because here's the thing. People like him only understand power when it stops flowing toward them. The rest of that morning was a blur of signatures, instructions, and strategy. Caroline brought in a partner from an employment law firm she worked with, a blunt woman named Denise Morgan, who spoke in bullet points and didn't waste oxygen on nonsense. She told me exactly what mattered in the next 24 hours. Preserve records, secure access, notify the bank, call a shareholder meeting, prevent unauthorized transfers. Do not meet my father alone. That last one came with a long look. And honestly, I appreciated it. We also looped in the CPA firm my grandmother had retained, and by noon, I was sitting in a side office with a woman named Sandra Patel, going through financial summaries that made me feel physically ill. She didn't dramatize anything. She just pointed with her pen. These recurring charges are personal. This transfer lacks support. This vendor appears connected to Melissa Carter's boot. This reimbursement pattern is irregular. Line after year after year sharpened. He hadn't just been sloppy and siphoning. And the worst part, he'd done it while underpaying staff, delaying raises, and whining about margins every time somebody asked for better health coverage. I thought about Tina at the front desk putting off dental insurance sucked. I thought about Jose, one of our best techs, driving an extra 40 minutes each way because he couldn't afford to move closer. Meanwhile, my father was charging patio furniture and weekend trips to the business. At one point, Sandra said, There's enough here to justify immediate controls. I said, Meaning? She looked me dead in the eye. Meaning, if he keeps access, records may disappear. That snapped me into motion. By early afternoon, we had a plan. First, Denise drafted a formal notice of my controlling interest and temporary authority. Second, Sandra contacted with documentation from the trust so we could require dual-approved significant transfer. Third, I called our software rep and locked down administrative changes on pay and customer database. Fourth, I reached out to the who actually kept the company functional. Tina, Jose, a Mark from dispatch, Carla, in billing. Not a group call, one by one. Those were hard conversations because I was asking people to trust me in the middle of chaos. I didn't tell them every legal detail. I just told them there had been an ownership change, payroll would be protected, and I needed them not to panic or help anyone alter records. You want to know something depressing? Not one of them sounded surprised that my father had something messy going on. Jose was the first one who said it out loud. He goes, Ryan, I've been waiting 5 years for this man to get caught doing something. I laughed so hard I almost cried. Then came the first close call. Around 3 in the afternoon, our bank notified Sandra that someone had attempted a large transfer from a company operating account into another account not previously used for payroll or vendor payment. The transfer hadn't cleared because the controls had already been flagged. Guess who had tried it? Yeah. When Denise told me, I actually had to sit down. It was so shameless. We were hours into this, and he was already trying to yank cash before the walls closed in. He didn't know yet that the bank had called us and thought he could bully his way through. Either way, it blew apart any last piece of me that still wanted to believe this could be handled quietly. That's when my anger got cold. Not loud, not theatrical. Cold. Christmas dinner had been personal humiliation. This was survival. Employees depended on that company for rent and groceries and childcare. My father was so obsessed with not losing control that he was willing to risk their livelihoods to protect his ego. That's when I stopped thinking in terms of family conflict and started thinking in terms of damage. By that evening, we'd scheduled an emergent shareholder meeting for the next morning. The board was tiny, mostly symbolic, but it existed. My father, me, one outside advisor and semi-retired for the kind of small business governance nobody pays attention to. It suddenly matters. Denise made sure every notice was airtight. Meanwhile, my phone kept lighting up. Calls, texts. At first it was my father, then Melissa, then people my father had clearly sent in. Can't you just talk to him? He's devastated. You know how your dad gets when he feels attacked. That one almost made me throw my phone. How he gets when he feels attacked. As if his feelings were weather and everybody else just needed umbrellas. Hannah finally took my phone, put it face down on the counter and said, "If they wanted access to you, they shouldn't have humiliated you publicly 12 hours ago." Again, right. The next morning, I went to the office, not alone. I'm glad because my father had already changed the front entry and told the morning staff I was not authorized to be there. Real mature stuff. Tina was standing inside the glass door, looking like she wanted to, because obviously he'd dragged him into it already. Showed up with documentation, a locksmith on standby, and the kind of posture that says, "You are not winning this argument." When my father came out of his office and saw us, he looked like he might actually have a stroke. He said, "You're not doing this here." Denise said, "We already are." He turned to me and tried once more to go personal. "Ryan, son, don't embarrass yourself." I swear to God, those were his words. "Son," after Christmas, I said, "I learned from the best." That shut him up for maybe 3 seconds. Then he started in again, said I was unstable, said Hannah and were manipulated, said Grandma had been, said the company would collapse without him, said I was being vindictive because he'd given me some hard truths at dinner, different costume for the same panic. We walked past him. That was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. Not because I enjoyed hurting him exactly. It was because, for once, his volume didn't matter. His intimidation didn't matter. His version of the story wasn't reality, just because he said it loudly. Inside the office, it got even uglier. A bunch of files were in the cabinet in his office. Paper receipts, handwritten expense note, reimbursement envelope. The digital records were mostly intact, moved faster than expected. But the paper had clearly... Sandra had warned us this might happen, so she wasn't shocked. Still, told us everything. When I asked, she looked at me and said, "He came in before sunrise." Of course, I knew he'd frozen non-essential company cards, locked administrative permission, and sent formal notice to key vendors that no payment instruction changes were valid without written confirmation from accounting. We also backed up the server and mirrored the customer database. It was boring, technical, stressful work, but every one of those steps felt like sliding a bolt into place on a door he'd been using to rob the house. And this is the part that still makes me laugh a little. Trevor, the shiny new operations guy my father had brought in, he lasted 6 hours. He showed up around 1 looking smug and confused at the same time. My father pulled him into the shop area and clearly tried to feed him some story about family betrayal and temporary legal nonsense. Trevor made it about 10 minutes into that nonsense before Denise calmly handed him the ownership notice and asked if he'd like to explain why he was preparing to assume duties under a disputed authority structure. The man practically evaporated. He literally said, "I don't want any part of this," grabbed his laptop bag, and left through the side door without saying goodbye to anyone. My father looked like he wanted to lunge at me. Instead, he pointed and said, "You're destroying your own inheritance." I said, "No, I'm protecting Grandma's." That line hit him hard. Hard enough that for a second I saw something real in his face. Not remorse, exactly. More like recognition. Like he suddenly understood that his mother had seen him clearly, and so did I. The board meeting the next morning was the kill shot. It wasn't dramatic and no one flipped tables, no one stormed out and got hit by a bus. It was worse because it was orderly, official, documented. The outside advisor, a guy named Warren who'd known my grandmother longer than he'd known my father, listened to Sandra's preliminary review and Denise's legal summary, expression that said he'd suspected more than he'd ever admitted. My father interrupted constantly. This is selective. These are business decisions. You can't remove me from my own company. But every time he records, filings, corporate documents, not my feel, not family gossip. It's very hard to scream. By the end of the meeting, with my majority vote supporting them, my father was suspended from operational pending completion of the forensic. His authority on accounts was revoked. Company property in his possession had to be returned. He was barred from directing staff. His face when Denise slid the written resolution across the table, I don't think I'll ever forget it. That was the moment from the hook, by the way. The moment everything finally made sense. The 36 calls, panic, the fake concern, the threats. The reason he went from, "You get nothing from me," to, "Please call me," in less than 12 hours was simple. He thought he held the knife and he realized he'd been standing on the trapdoor the whole time. But we weren't done. Not even close. The next were absolute chaos. You've never had to untangle a small business from a controlling liar. Let me suspense. Fuse a bomb someone built out of ego. Man and bad bookkeep. Every day brought some new disaster. Clients calling because my father had told them service would stop unless they waited for this family situation to resolve. A supplier asking why Melissa's boutique inventory was mixed into a heating equipment. A fleet fuel card showing purchases in another county after his access was supposedly frozen. A laptop missing from his office. An unsigned loan document Sandra found buried in a file marked holiday because of course he'd hide it there. That one huge, by the way. It looked like he'd tried to extend a line of credit using company assets and possibly documents that raised serious questions. Serious enough that Denise changed. She saw it. She said very carefully, "And do not contact him about this yet. That's lawyer code for, this just got way worse." And through all of it, I kept hearing Grandma's note in my head. Stop cleaning up your father's messes. So, I didn't. When relatives called to say maybe we should handle this privately, I said no. When Melissa sent me a 7-paragraph text about how stress was affecting Owen and how families should think of children first, I said no. When my father left a voicemail saying, "You're making me look like a criminal," I actually laughed out loud in my car because what he meant was, "You're no longer helping me look innocent." Still, it wasn't easy. That part matters too. Justice is satisfying, but it's exhausting when it runs through your own bloodline. I was sleeping maybe 4 hours a night. My shoulders felt like concrete. I was in the office before sunrise and still answering emails after midnight. Not because I wanted some revenge montage, because if I let things slip, 23 employees and their families would pay for my father's garbage. That responsibility sat heavy. Jose and Tina were incredible. So was Carla. Once the truth started leaking through the staff, people rallied in ways I didn't expect. Not because they loved drama, because they had stories, little ones and big ones, unpaid mileage, promised raises that vanished, tools borrowed and never replaced, public humiliation, threats over sick days. It turned out I wasn't the only person he'd been using fear on. I was just the one with enough access to finally put structure around it. One night, maybe 10 days in, I was sitting at my desk with Sandra going through expense classification when she found a run of charges to a luxury furniture store. Patio set, outdoor heaters, decorative planter, tens of thousands over several months. She asked where the items were. I said, "Not at the office." Then it clicked. The Christmas dinner house. The giant decorated patio where Melissa hosted summer parties. The outdoor heaters my father bragged about to guests. Company money. I actually had to lean back in my chair and close my eyes because it was such a grotesque little callback. The same house where he'd stood up and announced I got nothing from him had in part been furnished by siphoning money from the company my grandmother had protected from him. That realization gave me this dark, almost wicked little burst of satisfaction. Because suddenly, the whole image of him, king of the table, glass raised, declaring who belonged and who didn't, looked so pathetic. He wasn't sitting on wealth, he was sitting on a stage assembled from other people's labor, his mother's generosity, and now it was collapsing under him. A few days later, the confrontation that finally, whatever denial he still had left. He showed up at the office around 7 at night when most people were gone. I was still there with Jose in the back shop reviewing service schedule. 2 techs had called out sick, and January was already starting. Snow outside, fluorescent lights humming. That dead, echoey office ceiling after hours. Tina buzzed me and said, voice, "Your dad is here." Jose immediately stood up. I told him to stay. And then I called Denise before I even walked to the lobby. That's how conditioned I'd gotten. No solo conversations, no When I got to the front, wrecked. Not movie wrecked, real wrecked. Same coat as 2 days before, stubble, eyes bloodshot. He'd clearly stopped sleep. For half a second, some reflex in almost That old son reflex, the one that sees parents suffer and wants to rush in, brain catches up. Then I remembered him trying to move company money after reflex died. He said, I said, Denise is on. His jaw tightened. Jesus Christ, Ryan. No, I said. We're not doing this your. That silence, after I said it, felt incredible. He looked past me to the office, saw Jose standing there, saw staff still moving in the back, and realized he no longer controlled the. Then, I genuinely didn't expect. He started crying, not loudly, not performatively, like just the ugly, tired collapse. He sat down in one of the plastic lobby chairs and rubbed his face and said, I messed up. Honestly, that almost got me more than the yelling. Because if you've spent your whole life with even a late self-serve can hit like a drug, you want to believe it so badly. You want their way back to But then he kept talking. I got stretched. Your grandmother was always on me. Melissa wanted things. The business had bad months. I made some calls. I thought I could fix it before anyone noticed. There it was. Not, I'm sorry for humiliating. Not, I'm sorry I used. Not, I'm sorry I stole. Just excuses arranged in a sad voice. Then he looked up at me and said, You know, I always meant for this to be. I laughed. I actually laughed in his face. No, I said. You meant for me to keep running it while you dangled it. He flinched like I'd slapped him. And then, because people like him always save the side chat,